Welcome to Lean by Design podcast. I'm your host, Oscar Gonzalez, alongside my co-host, Lawrence Wong. We are former MBA classmates turned business partners with over 25 years of combined experience in life sciences. From R&D through manufacturing, our experiences have shed light into the complex, ever-changing challenges experienced by this industry and many others. We took a risk, quit our six-figure paying jobs in Boston, biotech, and pharma to start Sigma Lab Consulting. Journey with us as we explore the relationship between people and workflow design. The goal? To learn, inspire, and deliver practical tips to navigate these ever-changing challenges. Stick with us and learn to work smarter, not harder, and be lean by design. So here we are with season 3. It is 2026. I don't know about you, Lawrence. Last year went by very fast for me, and I'm still I'm not quite writing the 5 instead of a 6 at the end of the year, but I'm still trying to grapple the fact that it's January of this year. So here we are. We made it around the board, and I'm excited for what we're going to do in season 3 in this year. You know, we took some time earlier in the year later last year to understand what, our listeners, where they are. And we've been super fortunate to just see the reach that this podcast has brought. And I mean, we have people going as far out as Germany, in some areas of Europe, some Asia countries as well, that it's pretty incredible to see that the things that we're talking about, they matter globally. Like, these are challenges that people are having every day. And that's what we want to focus on in season 3 is how are we addressing, what do these problems really look like in biopharma, in the manufacturing space, in the facilities and R&D and clinical operations, even in other functions that are critical to operations, whether you are pre-commercial or a commercial enterprise. So I think it's going to be really important for us. It seems like our listeners really connected to the problems that we talked about last year in season 2. So this one's going to be especially, I think, really good and really informative for people, because we're going to tackle some issues that touch different areas of the organization and present problem personas. We're going to be presenting situations that we've experienced, situations that our clients have experienced, and situations that others that we've connected to have experienced. So I'm looking forward to this year and this season to just take a strong lens into how we're working every day and recognizing what that does to the culture of an organization, the consistency, the executive leadership alignment, when those things are not in line, when they're not really well thought out. And so today, it's when I was prepping for this episode, I thought of a story that we can bring in later on, but it has to do with bringing in new equipment online, bringing in new assets, and this notion that it feels much harder than it should be to bring something in. So I think it's important for us to really make sure that our listeners understand this problem, they feel this problem, what is actually happening here, and then sort of how do we identify that these are going to be problems in the future, and why do we care? Why do we care? And then, we could talk about solutions too. I think a lot of these things, we've talked about it before, are related to how the business decides to operate, how they decide to communicate, how they decide to create process and to, decide what to standardize or not to standardize, or maybe they don't even make a decision. Maybe they just allow that to the folks that are in that space or responsible for that work, if you actually know who those people are. But it's interesting because this is a problem. Onboarding assets, from my experience, and please chime in, this doesn't just show up in inexperienced teams. It shows up organizations that have been doing this time and time again, but it becomes a friction point that is seen as a task-related issue as opposed to this sort of transformative transition, that this bringing in new assets, making sure, IT is connected, ES knows what's happening. This is going to be producing this kind of waste, having all of that documentation, making sure that quality is there, making sure that it is validated prior to anyone working and that people are trained on it. Like, this is a whole thing. I mean, is this something that you're also seeing as well?
Yeah, this problem has been a problem for a long time, and it continues to exist. Whether you're in the simplest kind of situation, maybe you're moving into a non-GMP space. It's just a lab, and there's no product quality impact to some of the equipment, and so it might just be a space that you leased, and you're moving in equipment, and it's a brand new space, very easy to do. You get the shipment, you move it up to the spot where the scientist wants, you connect it, and then you start using it after the vendor maybe comes in and sets it up, right? So that's the simplest situation. Maybe your footprint's pretty small, but then we go to the other end of it where this is a lot of the larger companies kind of have this problem where you're bringing in equipment, or maybe you're working on an expansion of an existing site and you already have so many different policies and workflows in place, and you're having to integrate with those folks that are already at the campus, right? So some of the things you might run into are, we didn't know the shipment was coming today. Who's responsible for actually onboarding this equipment? Because you have all these different activities that are already going on. I think a lot of workflows are designed, especially at these large companies, to onboard a single asset at a time. And so when you think of like, oh, we actually have 1,000 things coming in, the volume just gets very overwhelming to really think about. But think about moving into a small apartment versus moving into a giant mansion where you have lots of people already doing stuff. It's just, there's a lot of activities going on, right? And I think that the process and the workflow is, I would say, pretty standard across the industry as far as the sequence of steps that you have to take. I think the difficulty is in coordination with all the people involved, right? Because that's usually, nobody is most of the time fully dedicated to just doing this one task because they have all these other responsibilities.
Right. Can you talk a little bit more about who would you typically find to be involved, and in your experience at what you've seen with larger facilities? And I can certainly speak to the ones that are not GMP, that are moving from one building to the next. And when there is no, and I had to do one of those things personally. And it was absolute chaos. I had everybody showed up at the same time. There were I had no idea that there were people specifically that had to come in, and they had to be the ones to move CO2 cylinders from one building to the next. I was being tasked with doing that on my own. I had the only card that could let any of the vendors into the buildings, and we had to transfer things, and there was no internal space. So they had to go outside of the loading dock, down across the street into another loading dock, up inside. And I was the only one that had my own card. None of the vendors did, but I had to walk them to each space. This included fume hoods. This included incubators and shakers and just massive refrigerators, freezers. And I'm trying to coordinate across two buildings with, I think we had 5 groups of people at the same time. And I was told, don't bother any of the scientists. You take care of this. And so this was something where everybody showed up. There was no plan. I had to keep pointing and running back to another building. It was just so chaotic. So I can't even imagine having that extra that extra layer of being GMP compliant that could really kind of throw a wrench into it, especially when trying to group all these people together. So when you're looking at this from a large business, a large enterprise, let's say you have to onboard, 25, 50 pieces of equipment. Who are the different groups of people that are involved? I imagine in some case the scientists are involved to let you know where they need something done, but also maybe EH&S because something is going to either, produce fumes that need to go out, or they need to be close to a sink to go down the proper drain. Who are all these people, and who actually is the one that is supposed to be coordinating those things?
We'll be right back after a quick break. In biopharma, success isn't just about innovation. It's about connection. between systems and teams, between data and decisions, between goals and the people driving them. At Sigma Lab Consulting, we call this the biopharma nexus, the network of relationships that hold your organization together and keeps progress moving. When those connections align, teams work with clarity, speed, and confidence. When they don't, workflows slow down, decisions take longer, and effort gets lost. We help life science organizations simplify how work gets done by strengthening the connections between people, processes, and technology so that your team can make better decisions and move faster with less friction. If you're ready to reduce complexity and restore flow, start with a risk check at sigmalabconsulting.com and start simplifying how work gets done. Yeah, so for that specific example, think of, so let's just say like it's 25 pieces of equipment, right? So when we talk about assets, again,
define that for us.
We'll define it differently, right? So asset is, in my mind, anything that you would need to maintain to support your operations, right? At a very basic level, how you structure the management of that asset, I think, makes a huge difference in the amount of data that comes along with it. So as an example, let's say your one equipment is a chromatography skid. And so in this skid, imagine it's a fairly large piece of footprint. You know, you've got pumps, you've got valves, you've got different sensors. And so each of those things I would consider an asset, right? So within the system itself, there's different components that make up. So each
system, which is the elements, the conditions, the constraints, each element can have a number of each system can have a number of assets that play a role in that system, is what you're saying.
Right. So like even if you go like, one level higher than that, think of the facility as one building. Within the building, you have different systems. They might be plumbing, they might be HVAC, they might be electrical, they might be mechanical, they might be process systems, they might be safety systems. So each of these system categories will have individual systems within that higher category, right? So let's take like plumbing as an example. That would include any of your gases, right? So CO2, oxygen, each of those things are systems. And so within the plumbing category, you have, let's say, CO2. Within CO2, now you look at how the system is designed, and maybe it has filters, maybe it has some pressure transmitters, pressure gauges. Each of those things I would consider an asset because you have to calibrate them on a defined frequency. You have to replace the filters at a defined frequency. Right. So each of those things would essentially be assets. So now think of an entire building. You have all these systems, you have all these different assets within the system, right? And it gets overwhelming. So back to your question about the different parties that are involved, I would think of it in sort of like three groups. You have the project team, which is really responsible for designing and installing and delivering that piece of equipment or system to the space, right? So they're more, think of like construction and this is all the project work that has to do with the designers, the builders, and the project engineers that really have to coordinate between the different contractors that actually make sure the space is ready, bring the equipment in, install it, and test it. And now the other group is going to be the support functions, right? So these are already existing functions at the campus. So think of safety, you think of the facilities team. There might be an existing validation team that helps with qualifying the equipment that's being installed. So those I would consider support functions. Quality control might be another group, right, where you have to do sampling when you install equipment. So once you do testing, you might need to sample to make sure that the equipment is doing what it's intended to do so that you can actually qualify the piece of equipment. And then the last group, which is the one that kind of brings everything together, is going to be the end user, right? So like you said, they might be a scientist, it might be an engineering group, it might be a manufacturing manager, but that is really the person who's going to be having their teams run the equipment for whatever that business purpose is going to be. And so when you think about equipment onboarding, it's very important for the project team to be on the same page with the support functions and also the end user, because all three of these groups really have to coordinate in order for the whole thing to be a success. And so what I like to say, like the person who is in charge of the asset onboarding is really like handling the handoffs between these different groups and making sure that what the project is building is going to meet both the testing requirements for the support functions, but also it actually meets the operational functions for the end user. And so that's why it gets very complicated, because even though you might have an asset onboarding process, if you're not frequently using it and people are involved, if it's just one thing that happens every 5 years or so, you're not going to remember the exact process for like moving stuff in. Whereas on the project side, there's usually a lot of, I would say, consultants and contractors where they're brought in specifically for this type of process. And so they might approach it one way, and then the campus itself, the support functions might say, wait, we actually have SOPs, work instructions, trainings on like how we actually do the asset onboarding, because it has to fit their requirements. And then there's other, I would say, things that the end user is going to look for, because they might manage their systems and equipment very differently than, say, if you're installing one thing, that's kind of like one scenario, but using it every day is a different thing to think about, right? Making sure people are trained, making sure they're familiar with all the buttons, all the alarms, all the different recipes that you might be able to run. And so the asset onboarding person or the team has to be aware of like, okay, they're looking for this information. We got to make sure that they're comfortable with the stuff after we've introduced it into their site.
Right. I mean, I think what you're pointing out is something that, a lot of us, in principle, we would think, oh, yeah, you got to connect with people. But oftentimes these things are not communicated well. So either they're happening very quickly and you have a very short notice. You might get an email on a Friday that says, hey, scientists, leave this area alone because we have stuff coming in on the next, Monday or Tuesday or something like that, or this is going to be offline, and you've already scheduled things for like a week in advance. And so, the stage that you've set for us, where there's this, you have to have this ability to have extreme coordination across vendors, internal contractors, internal employees and scientists, the support functions as well. Also understand what processes you guys have, in line, which ones are not, and a real technical understanding of where do these assets fit? Are they things that require a lot of validation and quality control, et cetera? Or is this something that is sort of a one-off that doesn't require as much, it doesn't take much of a footprint, doesn't really link into the systems, but we need to sort of onboard it. And as you know, when things are happening very quickly and sort of catch us by surprise, there's a lot of things that sort of add to the scramble. And I'm talking, things not having the right documentation, trying to rush installation because the planning was not adequate and we didn't know when they were coming in. We didn't realize there was a 4-day validation. We didn't know there was a wait list to have somebody specifically comes and works on this piece of equipment, because that's the reality of it, right? When we buy these very complicated pieces of equipment, the idea is not that the scientists are going to come and validate and onboard it. These businesses, these companies usually have somebody that is technically sound to say, this is how we're going to validate it. This is how we make sure that, I know in my small asset space going through the lab, we had to make sure that even when we were moving centrifuges, these are very large pieces of equipment, even table centrifuges, that they should be level. There should be no shaking. There should be no sounds, because these things are moving at Gs that are just beyond comprehension, right? 2100 Gs, et cetera. So you need something, and some are tens of thousands, these giant vats, so that you can create massive quantities of material. So when we're seeing those things, and we see that there's this sort of like single person that's running around trying to align everybody, where do you see most of those breakdowns happen, and how do you identify that those things are actually taking place?
Yeah, so I think if you have to look at it from a couple of different views, and I'll start with the project side, because I think that's a very fairly easy thing to explain, because when you're on the project team, you're aware of all the different things that are potentially coming because maybe you have access to the latest and greatest project updates, drawings, delivery dates, and things like that. And it's important to package that information so that the other, like the supporting functions and also the end user groups, understand what is happening, right? If you just send them a giant list of, hey, you're getting this stuff on this date, that doesn't mean anything because they already have 1,000 things going on and they're like, well, what am I supposed to do with this information, right? I think we often joke about secondhand stress. This is a real thing.
Yeah.
I think people often don't realize, like, their scope is this, and so they don't have to worry about the stress that they're handing off to other people when they complete the output of their work. And so on the project side, if you see that the information for understanding what is being delivered and when it's being delivered, how it's going to be installed, how the information is going to be collected, if there is no sort of clean and standardized ways to package that data, that's a huge red flag, and you should probably figure that out and not give this pile of mush to the other teams that are already on campus, because they're not going to know what to do with it, right?
It's just incomplete information.
It's not the best way to go about onboarding assets, because it decreases the confidence they have in you to deliver what you're supposed to do, right? So that's from there. Like, so really important to make sure that information is packaged correctly. I think so on the supporting function side, I think, knowing that there's a project going on, I think one of the things that I've seen happen, and this is not to their fault, it's just because they don't know the amount of capacity it's going to involve with their teams, right? Like if you already have stuff going on, a project is happening, you may not know the volume of assets coming in. And so the volume of assets coming in really dictates the volume of work that the supporting functions are going to have to do, right? So now, from the supporting function side, I think it's on them to perhaps educate the project team on the expectations for delivering a piece of equipment or a system or an asset is this. And this is what we typically do. These are the durations. This is the expectation based on the current capacity of our team, and to relay that information to the project team. Because if you don't, the project team is just going to assume that you're just going to be sitting on your hands and there's like you're not busy with all this other stuff that you're doing, right? And so really understanding from the supporting function side, what are the workflows and processes that you guys are constantly managing to help onboard the assets, right? We can't assume that the project team knows 100% exactly how to do these things, because they're not involved with the day to day. So they would lack the capability sometimes to provide that expertise.
And in this scenario, just quickly, in this scenario, the project team's main responsibility is to identify the assets that they need in order to carry out whatever manufacturing or experimentation they need to do, right? So they're more of like, here's the technical, gist of it in terms of getting it in, how it gets up and running, all that stuff. Like, they typically would not be the ones that have that knowledge. But like you mentioned before, it's going to be important for them to understand, what does that workflow look like? Does that mean that the asset comes in here and it's a week before we can use it? Because I've seen assets come in and people are planning experiments for the day the machine comes into the space. And it is the silliest thing, because they become very disappointed that, oh, I can't use this today. Absolutely not. It arrived. That's it.
Yeah, I was going to get to the end user group, which is kind of, you got to worry about both of those different groups, but I just want to finish my thought on the supporting functions group. So think about it like this. If the project is, let's say, installing a bunch of freezers, and the supporting functions are having to, let's say, maybe they have to do some temperature mapping of these potential freezers, right? It would be very helpful to know the specifications of the freezer so they can buy the right equipment to do the temperature mapping. Or for the facilities team, they need to have the right tools to maintain the things that you're going to be installing. So that's the level of the coordination.
For the temperature mapping, you're talking about, like, you have to detect in this case, a freezer, it's going to go up and down it's going to bounce a little bit in terms of temperature cycle, but you got to make sure it's within a certain range, right?
Exactly, right. So it would help to know, okay, well, if it's this kind of freezer, then I would need this length of wire or sensor, and so that you can actually do the things that you need to do to get that equipment to the right state. And also, when you're called upon to fix something, it would be helpful to know where you're putting it so that I can actually access it. It's a
Yes.
very
Yes.
common sense thing to think about, but you'd be so shocked by how little the project team sometimes thinks about those things. And I think the industry is getting a little bit better by incorporating a lot of those supporting functions early on so that they get eyes on the drawings and the design so they can comment on those things. And now from the end user side, you're right. They can't wait to get their hands on these things. They got stuff planned. They're hiring people to work on this stuff. And there's these deadlines that they've scheduled with their product teams or whatever functional groups. And so I think for them, the one thing that is often, they often have a lot of communication with the project team because they have things that they want to buy or things that they want to change in the design based on what they need the area to do. But they often forget to talk to the supporting functions to say, hey, you got to make sure that this equipment is safe and ready to operate. It's not the fact that you install something and it's ready, right? Like I think people often see, oh yeah, the incubator is here, and then they start using it. It's like, no. You can't just do that. You have to make sure that that incubator is actually onboarded into let's say the maintenance program so that we have to service it every 6 months and these different departments that have to support the end user once they're up and running. And I think a lot of times that's often forgotten. And the worst situation is you have something installed, the end user starts using it, and then they go, oh, it broke. And then they call the facilities guy to come over and they're like, I didn't even know you bought this thing.
You had this. Where was this? Right. Yeah.
Right. And you think about the whole thing, there's a lot of financial implications when people do this. Is I didn't budget this in my maintenance and repair spend. So now there's an increase that I have to justify because you didn't tell me that you were, buying and installing this thing. So there's a lot of, from a business point of view, a lot of communication that has to happen. And also on the technical end, right? Making sure that the actual physical equipment itself is designed, installed, tested in the way that the end user is going to be used, but also wherever the final location is, the supporting functions have to be able to support that operation.
Right. No, I mean, you're hitting on some really important parts here. And I think from my side, a lot of my exposure to this area has been from the end user. And it's, I've seen a lot of we're ready to use it. Let's just use it. It can, and when you do this without the proper testing, the proper validation, I've seen people put things into an incubator and come out and look under the microscope and go, why do my cells look like this? Like they shouldn't. The morphology of the cells is not the morphology of this particular cell line. What happened? And it's, we set this up. The CO2 was acting kind of funny. We didn't, whatever the situation is, but it's those lack of really setting things up so that you're not being met with speed bump after speed bump trying to get up and running. Because what all of this, really comes down to is that it's going to take longer to get things up and running when we don't do these things. You said it before, the trust, the confidence that we have that this is giving us the right thing. I've done experiments on machinery and been like, on equipment, been like, wow, this is fantastic. And then come to find out we had not had the system calibrated in like 4 years. Like, well, maybe for a paper, but this is definitely not going to be able to, this is not going to work out once we're trying to really move this asset, move this biological to say that it acts this way or acts that way. If the equipment we used was never onboarded, which means it never went into the maintenance program. And, the conversation that we're having here is probably geared more toward more mature organizations that have a maintenance program, that have an onboarding process. But I would venture to say that there's a lot of, as these companies grow, there's this over reliance in tribal knowledge of like, oh yeah, ask Pete, he knows what the setup is, but there's no documentation, there's no training to actually do these things. So as these new sites are being built out, either people are starting things from scratch or they're just not using anything and we're just going to get everything all set up and it's going to be hunky dory. But as as you're aware, if there's a lack of standardized framework to onboard the things, we're going to fall into these problems. If we're undefined in what that readiness criteria meant. You were talking about the functions before, the support functions, and them being able to communicate, what does it mean that this is ready to be used? What is the go light, the live, this machine is live, it's hot, let's make some science. What does that mean across the functions? What does that mean for the vendor that came in to bring it in? What does that mean for the validation expert? What does that mean for your own experiments? Because even if people validate, you should run a few controls, right? You should run a few controls before you do any kind of scientific exploration to make sure that, yes, in our old system, we got this as the data. In our new system, we got something that was within standard error. This is good to go. We've done it 3 times. Taking the diligence. And I think sometimes that's where we fall is, that extra thing that we're thinking, well, this is just something extra. It's not that important. But the people that are saying that are the people that don't understand the intricacies of that whole system. Because like you said, it's a system. A system is in itself living and breathing, expanding, and requires that maintenance, requires that keen eye into what's happening, how things are moving in and out, how they're being brought into, those programs. Because as you mentioned before, everybody has a budget, and when we're not aligned, everybody's budget's going to go up. Your timelines are going to be delayed. I now have more work to do because we did not go through the proper channels. We did not involve the right people. So that's a real risk that, is the risk is not that we can't execute quickly. It's that when you don't have those systems set up, you're introducing fragility to any reproducibility. Okay, that was a great smooth asset. Maybe that was a one-off because you only had 2 or 3 that were in one domain of science. But now you're onboarding assets that touches, the gene space and the molecular space and the cell space. And now these are all different kinds of assets that have different kinds of requirements. So there's, that we want to go fast, but if you try to, it's almost like driving off the lot and, they didn't get to log in the bolts of your tires, or they didn't finish putting in the brake line. It's going to work, but it's probably going to fail soon.
Right. It's going to fail. And also, I think a lot of times when you get to the end of all this, when people find out that maybe there were things missed as part of the asset onboarding process, it often may or may not create quality events, right? So quality events I would refer to as like a deviation, and now they find that certain things were missing, and now you have to open up a CAPA. There's just added work for stuff that we should have been better at if we had just coordinated better, right? And now you have to open up a change control, and like there's just all this added work that you have to do because we were rushing, or maybe the timelines, whatever it was. The more I think in sync, of these different groups are, the better. The risk is, you're right. It's to not only you being able to run the site or the facility or the group in a certain way, but it's all the added cost, the wasted time, the people that now have to focus on a problem that shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Right.
And that when you have those things start to pile up in addition to the things that are already happening on the campus, it starts to, I don't know if degrading the culture is the right word, but it definitely increases the level of distrust among the different groups, right? Because now it's like, okay, well, who's assigned to do this investigation? Is it my fault or is it their fault that they didn't provide this? And it becomes this blame game, and it's a very toxic situation that starts to happen.
People are looking for that too. Like, well, who is it to blame? Well, the system is sort of the issue. Is that there was a little, I'm partial to just saying it's laziness, but sometimes it could be that, the wrong person was given the task to do something that they were not fully qualified to do. So there was a lot of things that were missed. But this is, again, creating the rework, creating the duplication. Well, now we have to do this again because we didn't do it right the first time, which means we have to call the person back to come up. And they have a backlog of 3 months because the only person that facilitates or that works on this type of equipment and does the validation in this region is not here or is gone, or, there's so many little things that we fail to sort of recognize and understand that those early parts in the process can really be damaging to your ability to be up and running and producing the things, because ultimately that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get these things set up so that the science can continue and assets, those kinds of assets can be experimented, can be delivered. And that's when we really forget about those foundational things. You're building that toxic culture, and it's in some ways out of ignorance, in some ways out of laziness, in some ways, perhaps you're not giving the due respect to that process. And especially in a GMP facility, there's no real rationale to skip those pieces, whether or not they deliver a quality event, So if people are out there and they're just like, if there's listeners out there and they're thinking, anytime we do this asset onboarding, anytime we're bringing in something new, it's like a disaster, and the people are hard to work with. And every time I go somewhere else, they point me to somewhere else. If I think this group is responsible for providing X, they go, yeah, I'll get it to you when I can get it to you. What are some of the things that people can be doing to sort of improve how they onboard assets into their facilities, or even whether or not it's a GMP facility or not, even if it's just moving an academic research lab from one building on campus to the next? What are sort of some baseline things that we could be doing and looking out for?
Yeah, and I'm all right. So whatever I'm going to say is very biased, because it's going to come from the point of view of both, like the supporting function, because usually they get all the blame for this because they're interacting with the project team, and they have their customer essentially is the end user, right? And so I think the best thing to do if you find yourself in a situation like this is to look at the onboarding process to get a single asset into the system, right? So now don't pick the easiest one. Obviously, you'd want to pick the one that is the most difficult to get through the system, right? One that has many different components, one that maybe has a lot of safety implications, something that has a lot of risk to the business, right? And so there's a lot of emphasis on what is the best way to kind of get this through the business process so that we have a happy customer that can operate the equipment safely and in the way that it's designed. We have a supporting group that their teams can maintain and test and do whatever activities they need to do to support the end user. And then the project team, for them to deliver the asset in the best way possible so that you don't have to call contractors back in to do any rework on the space, and because you don't want that as well, is think about how you would get a single system or asset through this business process, and make sure that everybody is on board with what that looks like, right? And it might be having to do with the project team having a checklist of like, these are the things I need to have so that I can get the right information, so I can give it to the validation team or the facilities people so they can put it into their maintenance program. It might be having the manuals ahead of time so that the end user can draft the right trainings and write their SOPs and work instructions, right? So there's understanding how you would get one through the system, and then look at where the things take the most time or people are saying that this is the most painful, and try to focus on that. Okay, so you're mentioning that it takes a long time for you to develop the trainings. Okay, well, why? Well, we don't know what the equipment looks like until it's installed. Okay, well, could you talk to the project team and maybe get some of the drawings and maybe get in touch with a vendor so they could do a visit so they can show you what it is that you're going to be using?
Yeah.
Maybe that would help you draft the training. Maybe there's something already exists. Maybe you can bring them in. Maybe they can do the training for your team. So having that coordination would help. But that's how I would approach it, by like a system by system kind of approach. And once you've kind of ironed that process out, now you can streamline it, and then now you can do a bunch of systems at the same time, but you really have to iron it out for a single system. How would you get the most complicated and high risk thing through this business process? And it doesn't have to be complicated. A lot of these things are very obvious, right? Like once you understand how it impacts other people around you, you're going to ask the right questions to say, I know so-and-so is going to be actually, he has to get up on a ladder to reach a certain thing. is there space for a ladder? There's just very simple things like this. And then another person is like, oh, this person has to kneel down to like maybe undo a clamp to replace a certain seal when they, connect a hose. It's like, does that person have enough space to do that work? Is there a drain nearby? So maybe there's, potential liquid coming out of that pipe. Is safety aware? So maybe we need to get some PPE for that space. Like there's certain things that you need to ask. Like, you just look at it from a system by system basis. How are you going to operate and maintain this thing at the end? And then the project team, looking to see, their incentive is really to like wrap this thing up on time, on budget.
Right.
But you also want the supporting functions and your end users to be happy with the product that you're delivering to them, right? So they don't come back to you and go, oh, we need a change order. And now you're going to have to write a check for however much money. Kind of looking at it from the start to the finish. How do I install, test, operate, and maintain this thing safely, for the business? Think about it as a whole thing. And then once you kind of do that for one system, you just apply the same philosophy to everything that else is going into the facility itself.
Well, Lawrence, you make it sound so simple, and it's and it's great. And I think one of the challenges that I think is presented in the way that we conduct work, the way that we think about things, is that we like to look at things through a system lens to understand what are all the connecting pieces and the elements and the stakeholders and the potential impact to different people, which is not a natural thought. Folks are typically going to say, what's my job today? Oh, I got this thing coming in, and then I got to let people know that it's happening. And then, that's kind of it. It might be sort of nonchalant in that way. And, as you mentioned before, you have to sort of do a deep dive into understanding what do you already have set up internally? What systems in place? What scheduling do you have in place? What workflows and frameworks and SOPs and quality, like understanding really what that workflow looks like. And if it is not available, draw it out. Like, here's all the steps that happen. And then, it's, as you mentioned before, like, it seems a little bit obvious, perhaps when you're actually doing it and thinking about steps that happen later on. But in the moment when people are moving things and, oh, I just called somebody coming in to validate or called somebody coming in to do this, but you're sort of ignoring all the other aspects of onboarding and assessment, you sort of end up with half completed assessments. Oh, we have a few change orders, because there's a lot of things to consider, and it all depends on the type of asset that's coming in. As you mentioned before, what is the cycle for maintenance for this particular piece of equipment? What are the things that are likely to go or to break down earliest? And are those things that we can replace, or are those things that we have to preemptively schedule support for that? Because these assets are in the tens, hundreds, even millions of dollars, depending on what it is. And those are things that they are literally assets to the business. So having them up and running as functional as possible is the best opportunity for success with everyone aligned. So if someone were to come and say, Lawrence, we have a few things, but it just feels bumpy, and I don't know which part of our process is the most bumpy or is the one that requires more attention. We are so thrilled to say this today, here and now, that we actually have an assessment that can help pinpoint where your biggest issues are, when we look at these risk factors, from the data of the asset to handing it off, who's making decisions, is the support ready? And then how are you going to train and look at the competency that people can actually use this piece of equipment and be trained and validated in doing so? We have an assessment that's part of our suite of assessments that we're launching in 2026. It is actually now available. This assessment is specific for asset and facility onboarding readiness. So I invite everyone to take a look at our website and see what we have made available to you all. And now you can really take all this knowledge that Lawrence has. These were things that we have built in-house. We built these assessments and these modules based on our philosophy for how we operate and look at organizational problems through a systems thinking lens. So it is a fantastic, if you want to add a couple of more points to there, Lawrence, please do. But I think this is a fantastic opportunity for anyone that's sort of, we feel like we have things going, but there's always just some rockiness, and we're not exactly sure is, that we're not training people the right way. Is it that our support teams are not in the conversations as much as we should have them? But this helps really tease out a lot of the he said, she said, they did this, they did that, removing the issue that people assume is other people and looking at it as, what is the process? What did you put down on paper? What are you lacking to communicate how these things should be done? So I'm excited to announce that our assessment suite is up and live, and we have something specifically to address these types of issues here.
Yeah, and then the assessment itself it's agnostic to the size of the facility you have, or whether or not it's GMP or non-GMP. And it's really, we've built it in a way that it's almost like a self-reflection, and we're providing some guidance on some of a lot of the mistakes that we've made, so that you don't have to make them again. And I think that's really the biggest thing I want to promote is, there's no right answer into how you navigate the asset onboarding process. Every company has different policies. Your assets are going to be different. Whatever you're doing in the building is going to be different. The departments are different. And so I think what we're trying to do here is to help our clients, but also just the industry, kind of step back and take a look at, okay, if I answer some of these questions, it kind of highlights to us what those problem areas are. And 99% of the time, these problems are not siloed problems. They're somewhat related.
Yes.
The idea is to really focus on a problem statement that kind of combines these things, right? Because it's not like when you fix, if you collect all the asset data, great. But if nobody knows how to order any parts, then, well, did you really make it effective? And so these pieces are very interconnected, and I think it's something that we're proud to put out there, and we hope that you guys find it useful, and you can check it out on our website. And there's going to be some more content that we're putting out in relation to the assets, but our website's kind of the best place to learn about it, and not just that assessment, but the other ones, and just a little bit about how we think about these issues.
And that's sigmalabconsulting.com. You can go there right on the homepage. You're going to see sort of a lead into what the assessment is going to be like, what that experience is like. And you can further go, as Lawrence said, go in and see like, what are the types of challenges that we're tackling by creating these assessments. And it also, ultimately these assessments are a reflection tool, but they end in a one-on-one virtual engagement with Lawrence or myself, where we can walk you through these multiple risk factors that are playing a role into the chaos that you're experiencing. Because as Lawrence said, we are working in the biopharma industry. These are connected systems. And in many cases, they are fragmented. So they're connected in some areas, but they're sort of these little pockets of black holes, almost like a giant 1,000-piece puzzle, where just a couple of pieces are missing, and your brain is going to connect the whole picture and say, yeah, I see the whole picture. But these pieces that are missing are absolutely critical to having a solid foundation of operations. And I think I'm really excited that we're putting this out there, and I really hope that people see the value and really feel that this is giving them time to slow down and reflect on what they've actually been dealing with. And at the end, you're also going to end up with a report that you can surface to leadership to start having these conversations. And if you ever decide in the future to engage with us, we'd be more than happy to continue that conversation and see how we can help support your facility readiness. So I'm very excited for 2026. There's a lot of things coming out. And, again, check out our website, sigmalabconsulting.com, for more information on all of that. Lawrence, I think this was great. I felt the pain. I just kept playing back in my head, just like so many areas where things will just stop in the process of onboarding assets, that we not just that stop, but maybe they go all the way through, and then your equipment's on board and it's one speed bump after the next because things were not done as they were intended to in the beginning, as they should have been in the beginning. So I think this is a super important topic, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about it today. So Lawrence, thanks. I think it was a great conversation. And I'm sure that some of our listeners out there are feeling the pain right now. So hopefully they can get some relief after checking out those assessments.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll see you guys on the next one.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to leave us a review, like, and share on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're interested in being on the show or becoming a sponsor, send us a message at leanbydesign@sigmalabconsulting.com.